At 6:18 a.m. on March 24, 1942, Technical Sergeant Robert Neale knelt in the red Burmese mud beneath the oil-streaked belly of a P-40 Warhawk at Magwe Airfield, watching his pilot, Lieutenant Danny Hayes, strap into a cockpit that housed 6 guns that would probably jam when he needed them most. Bobby had been in Burma for 4 months. He'd watched 11 pilots die. Not from enemy fire. From gun failures. The P-40s .50 caliber Brownings were eating the wrong ammunition. Ball rounds, tracer rounds, armor-piercing rounds, all different weights, all loaded together in the same belt. The feed mechanism couldn't handle it. 30 seconds into combat, the guns would jam. Pilots would be left defenseless. Zeros would close in. Men would die. Hayes was 22 years old. Kansas City kid, this was his 9th mission, 0 kills. He'd fired his guns on 6 separate engagements. They jammed every single time. Bobby had spent the previous night doing something that could get him court-martialed. He'd reloaded Hayes' ammunition belts in a pattern that violated every technical order in the manual. If it worked, it would save lives. If it failed, Hayes would die and Bobby would be responsible. Robert Neale was 26 years old, a dirt track mechanic from Dodge City, Kansas, who joined the Army Air Corps in 1939 because he was tired of fixing tractors. He'd been good with engines since he was 12. His father ran a garage. Bobby had rebuilt his first car engine at 14. By 17, he was racing modified Fords on dirt tracks outside town. The Army sent him to technical school at Chanyu Field. 6 months learning aircraft systems. He graduated second in his class. They offered him officer candidate school. He turned it down. Officers gave orders. Mechanics fixed problems. Bobby liked fixing problems. He'd arrived in Burma in November 1941, assigned to the 1st American Volunteer Group's maintenance section. Most people called them the Flying Tigers. Bobby just called them his pilots. 18 men who trusted him to keep their aircraft flying. In 4 months, he'd seen 11 of them die. The P-40 Warhawk was a good fighter. Tough, fast in a dive, could take damage and keep flying. But it had one fatal problem, killing American pilots every single day. The guns wouldn't feed properly when loaded with mixed ammunition. Standard operating procedure required mixing ammunition types. 4 ball rounds for general damage. 1 tracer round so pilots could see where they were shooting. 1 armor-piercing round to penetrate enemy armor. The pattern repeated through the entire belt. 267 rounds per gun. 6 guns. 1,602 rounds total. But the 3 ammunition types had different weights. Ball rounds were lightest. Tracers were heavier. Armor-piercing rounds were heaviest. When the gun fired at 800 rounds per minute, the feed mechanism struggled. The heavier rounds didn't push the lighter rounds forward smoothly. The belt would skip. The gun would jam. In textbook conditions on the ground, it worked fine. In combat, with G-forces, vibration, heat, and stress on the mechanism, the guns failed constantly. Bobby had filed 7 reports. He'd explained the problem in detail. He'd requested authorization to test different loading patterns. Every request came back the same way. Ammunition loading procedures are within specifications. No modifications authorized. Specifications didn't matter when pilots were dying. Lieutenant William Bill Reed had been the first one Bobby knew personally. 23 years old, Portland, Oregon. Flew freight planes before the war. Cheerful kid who always brought Bobby coffee when he worked late. February 8, 1942. Reed engaged 4 Japanese Ki-43 Oscars over the Salween River. Got good position on the leader. Pressed trigger. All 6 guns fired for exactly 3 seconds before jamming simultaneously. Reed tried to clear them. Couldn't. Tried to dive away. 3 Oscars followed him down. They shot him to pieces over the river. His P-40 hit the water at 300 miles per hour. Bobby had watched from the airfield with binoculars. He'd loaded Reed's ammunition belts the night before. Standard pattern. By the book. Within specifications. Reed died anyway. Lieutenant Charles Charlie Older was next. March 2nd, 24 years old, Los Angeles. Studied engineering at UCLA for 2 years before dropping out. Smart kid. Understood mechanical systems. He'd asked Bobby 3 times if there was anything they could do about the guns. Bobby had told him the truth, not without authorization. Older died 12 days after Reed. Engaged 6 Zeros northeast of Magwe. Shot down one in the first pass. His guns worked perfectly for 45 seconds. Then they jammed. All 6. Older radioed his wingman. "Guns are dead, I'm out." He tried to run. The Zeros caught him. They killed him 8 miles from the airfield. His P-40 burned on impact. They found his body still strapped in the cockpit. Bobby had loaded Older's guns, too. Standard pattern. By the book. 2 dead pilots in 3 weeks. The other mechanics saw it happening. They filed their own reports. Same response. Within specifications. The engineering officers explained that the Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun was one of the most reliable weapons ever made. The problem must be maintenance. Were they cleaning the guns properly? Were they checking headspace? Were they using the correct lubricant? Yes. The guns were perfect. The ammunition loading pattern was killing people. By mid-March, the first AVG had lost 37 P-40s in 6 weeks. Some to combat damage, some to mechanical failure. But 14 had gone down with gun jams reported on the radio before they died. 14 pilots had radioed "guns jammed" or "guns dead" in their final transmissions. 14 men who'd gotten into good firing positions, pulled their triggers, and died when nothing happened. The Japanese pilots had started to notice. They'd begun pressing attacks more aggressively. They knew the P-40's guns failed constantly. They'd gotten bolder. Why run from a fighter that can't shoot? Bobby had spent 2 weeks studying the problem. He'd read the technical manuals. He'd talk to other armorers. He'd test-fired guns on the ground with different loading patterns. He'd timed the feed cycles. He'd measured the weight differences between ammunition types. He'd figured out what was going wrong. The solution was simple, stupidly simple. Load the heaviest rounds first in each sequence. 4 armor-piercing rounds to start, then 2 tracers, then ball rounds to fill out the belt. The heavier rounds would push the lighter ones through smoothly. The feed mechanism wouldn't skip. The guns wouldn't jam. He'd submitted his findings in a detailed report on March 18th. He'd included test-fire data. He'd shown the math. He'd explained exactly how to fix it. The response came back March 22nd. Proposed modification deviates from approved specifications. Testing would require approval from Army Ordnance Department. Estimated timeline, 6 to 8 months. Request denied. 6 to 8 months. How many more pilots would die in 6 months? Lieutenant Denny Hayes was going up this morning. And Bobby had decided he wasn't going to die by the book. The Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun fired 800 rounds per minute. That meant 1 round every 0.075 seconds. The feed mechanism used a sprocket system that pulled the ammunition belt forward, positioned the next round, and fed it into the chamber. The entire cycle took exactly 0.075 seconds when everything worked perfectly. But perfectly required every round to have the same weight and dimensions. When they didn't, the timing went wrong. A standard ball round weighed 42.9 grams. A tracer round weighed 44.1 grams. An armor-piercing round weighed 46.3 grams. The difference between lightest and heaviest was 3.4 grams, about the weight of a nickel. That fraction of a gram caused the feed mechanism to hesitate. When a heavy round followed a light round, the sprocket had to work harder to pull the belt forward. Under stress G-forces, vibration, heat, that tiny hesitation caused the belt to skip. The gun would try to fire with no round in the chamber. Jam. The pilot would be defenseless. Bobby had explained this in 3 separate reports. The response was always the same. The ammunition loading pattern came from Army Ordnance Department Technical Order the 1st of November 38, published September 1940. It specified the exact ratio: 4 ball, 1 tracer, 1 armor piercing, repeat. The specification was based on ground testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The tests showed a jam rate of less than 1%. But Aberdeen tested guns mounted on static stands. No G-forces, no vibration, no combat stress. The test didn't reflect reality. In Burma, the jam rate was 40%. The engineering officers wouldn't authorize field modifications because the guns were within specifications. If they approved unauthorized changes and something went wrong, they'd be liable. Better to follow the manual and let pilots die than break the rules and risk court-martial. Bobby understood their position. He didn't agree with it, but he understood it. The warranty issue made it worse. The Browning M2 was manufactured by Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company under contract. If field modifications damaged the weapons, the Army would have to pay for replacements. Colt's contract specifically stated that unauthorized modifications voided the warranty. Every gun cost $667. Each P-40 carried 6. That was $4,002 per aircraft. Multiply by 60 P-40s in theater over $240,000. Nobody wanted to be the officer who authorized a modification that cost the Army $250,000. So pilots kept dying. Lieutenant Thomas "Tom" Haywood was the 13th. March 18th, 25 years old, Birmingham, Alabama. Former crop duster, married. Wife was pregnant. He'd shown Bobby the letter that morning. They were having a girl. Haywood went up at 1340 hours with 3 other P-40s. They intercepted 8 Japanese Ki-43 Oscars southeast of Magwe, 12,000 feet. Haywood got perfect position on one Oscar 60 yards behind, slightly above, textbook deflection angle. He radioed, "I've got him, I've got him." Then guns jammed, I'm out. His wingman, Lieutenant James "Jim" Howard, watched it happen. Haywood had fired for maybe 4 seconds. Then nothing. The Oscar pulled up in a hard climbing turn. Haywood tried to follow. 2 more Oscars came in from his right. Haywood saw them. He tried to dive, too late. They hit him with a combined burst that lasted 3 seconds. 20mm cannon shells walked up his right wing and into the cockpit. The P-40 rolled inverted and went straight down. Howard chased the Oscars off. He circled the crash site. The P-40 had hit nose first in a rice paddy. The impact crater was 15 feet deep. Haywood's body was still in the wreckage. Howard could see him from the air. The cockpit had compressed to about 3 feet long. There was no chance of survival. Howard landed at 14:25 hours. He went straight to Bobby's workshop. He didn't say hello. He didn't make small talk. He said, "Tom's guns jammed, all 6. He was dead center on that Oscar. He pulled the trigger and nothing happened. They killed him. Is there anything at all you can do about these goddamn guns?" Bobby had looked at him for a long moment. Then he'd said, "Not officially." Howard had stared back. "Then do it unofficially. Tom's wife is having a baby in June. He's not going to meet his daughter because his guns didn't work." That was March 18th, 6 days ago. Bobby had spent the next 3 days running tests. He'd pulled the guns from 2 P-40s undergoing engine maintenance. He'd set them up on test stands in the armory workshop. He'd loaded belts with different patterns. Standard pattern first. 4 ball, 1 tracer, 1 armor piercing. He'd fired 500 rounds, 14 jams. 2.8% jam rate on the ground. Unacceptable. Second test. All ball rounds. 0 jams. But ball rounds alone wouldn't penetrate armor, wouldn't give pilots visual tracking. Wasn't a solution? Third test. His pattern. 4 armor piercing, 2 tracer, then ball rounds to fill out the sequence. The heaviest rounds first, pushing the lighter rounds through. He fired 1,000 rounds. 0 jams. He'd run the guns hot continuous firing until the barrels glowed. Zero jams. He'd mounted the test stand on a truck and driven down the runway at 60 miles per hour to simulate vibration. Fired 500 more rounds. Zero jams. The modification worked. He had the data. He filed another report on March 21st with complete test results. Response came back the same day. Unauthorized testing of non-standard ammunition loading patterns is prohibited. Submit all test data to Army Ordnance for official evaluation. Estimated review timeline: 4 to 6 months. Do not implement field modifications pending official approval. 4 to 6 months. It was March. By September, how many more pilots would be dead? Bobby had made his decision that night. He wasn't going to wait for approval. He wasn't going to watch more pilots die while officers in Maryland reviewed paperwork. Lieutenant Danny Hayes had come to the workshop on March 23rd. He'd stood in the doorway watching Bobby work. Finally, he'd said, "I'm going up tomorrow. Escort mission. They're expecting heavy resistance. My gun's jammed on the last 3 missions. Is there anything you can do?" Bobby had stopped working. He'd looked at Hayes, 22 years old, Kansas City. Enlisted 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Good pilot, careful, smart. 0 kills because his guns jammed every time he engaged. Hayes had kept talking. "I'm not afraid of dying. I knew what I signed up for. But I'm afraid of dying because my airplane doesn't work. I'm afraid of getting into position, pulling the trigger, and having nothing happen. That's not combat. That's execution." Bobby had made his decision. "Come back at midnight. Don't tell anyone. Don't write it down. Just come back." Hayes had nodded and left. Bobby had spent the evening preparing. He'd pulled Hayes' aircraft number 47, the Kansas Tornado, into the back maintenance hangar. He'd locked the doors. He'd pulled all 6 guns. He'd stripped every ammunition belt. The work had taken 8 hours. He'd reloaded every belt by hand. 267 rounds per gun. 6 guns, 1,602 rounds total. Each one placed in the new pattern. 4 armor-piercing, 2 tracer, 5 ball, repeat. The sequence ran through the entire belt. Heavy rounds pushing light rounds. Smooth feed. No jams. His hands had been shaking the whole time. This was a court-martial offense. Unauthorized modification of armament systems. Violation of technical orders. Possible destruction of government property. If the modification failed, if Hayes' guns exploded, or if the rounds cooked off, or if something went wrong, Bobby would be held responsible. He'd spend the war in Leavenworth. But Hayes was going up in the morning. And without this modification, he was going to die. Bobby had reinstalled the guns at 0430 hours. He test-fired them 20 rounds per gun on the ground. All 6 worked perfectly. He'd cleaned them, checked headspace, lubricated the feed mechanisms. Everything was perfect. Hayes had shown up at 0530. He'd looked at the aircraft. He'd looked at Bobby. He'd said, "You fixed them?" Bobby had said, "I reloaded them. Different pattern, tested clean. Should work in combat." Hayes had asked the important question, should? Bobby had told him the truth. "I've done everything I can. Test data says it'll work. But I haven't tested it in actual combat. You're the test." Hayes had nodded slowly. Then he'd said, "If I die because you tried to help me, that's on me. If I die because nobody tried, that's on everyone. Let's see if it works." Now it was 0618 hours. Hayes was strapping in. The mission briefing was at 0630. Takeoff at 0745. And Bobby was about to find out if he'd saved a life or ended his career. The mission briefing was straightforward. 9 P-40s would escort 6 A-20 Havoc bombers attacking Japanese supply dumps near Pyongyang, about 80 miles south of Mandalay. Intelligence expected heavy fighter opposition. At least 20 Japanese fighters were based at Pyongyang. The Americans would be outnumbered 2 to 1. Hayes was flying in the number 3 position, right wingman to the flight leader. Captain Robert Bob Prescott. Prescott was 31 years old, a former Navy pilot who joined the AVG in 1941. Good leader, aggressive. 12 confirmed kills. His P-40 guns had never jammed, he'd been lucky. Bobby watched the briefing from the back of the room. He wasn't supposed to be there. Enlisted men didn't attend officer briefings. But Prescott, a rule. Your crew chief could watch if he wanted to. Bobby always wanted to. Prescott finished the briefing at 0715. Weather's clear, visibility unlimited. We take off at 0745, form up over the field, proceed south at 12,000 feet. Bombers will be at 10,000. We stay 2,000 feet above them. Japanese fighters will probably come from the north. They like altitude advantage. We'll see them first. When contact occurs, we engage. Keep them off the bombers. That's the mission. He'd paused, looked at each pilot. Gun jams are a problem. Everyone knows it. If your guns fail, call it out immediately and break off. Don't try to fight without weapons. Don't be a hero. Get clear and head home. Understood? Everyone had nodded. They all knew the statistics. Almost half the pilots in the room had experienced gun jams in combat. 3 of them were flying with 0 confirmed kills because their guns had failed every single time. Hayes had caught Bobby's eye across the room. The look said, "Mine won't fail today, right?" Bobby had nodded, a tiny nod, barely visible. But Hayes had seen it. The pilots had dispersed to their aircraft at 0730. Bobby had followed, Hayes to number 47. Hayes had done his walk-around inspection, tires, wings, control surfaces, everything. He'd climbed into the cockpit at 0738, strapped in. Connected his oxygen mask and radio leads. Started the engine at 0740. The Allison V1710 had caught immediately, coughing blue smoke, settling into a rough idle. Prescott's engine started, then the others. 9 P-40s, engines running, propellers spinning. The noise was incredible. The smell of aviation fuel and exhaust filled the air. Bobby stood 20 feet from Hayes' wingtip, watching. Hayes looked at him one more time. He gave a thumbs up. The gesture said, "Thank you for trying." Bobby gave a thumbs up back. The gesture said, "Don't die today." At 0745, Prescott's P-40 rolled forward. The others followed in sequence. Hayes was third. They taxied to the runway in single file, engines roaring, tails up. Bobby watched them go. The first P-40 took off at 0747. Prescott accelerated down the dirt runway. Engine at full power, prop wash kicking up red dust. The tail came up after 200 feet. The main gear lifted off after 800 feet. He climbed out straight ahead, banking left after clearing the tree line. The second P-40 followed 30 seconds later. Then Hayes, Bobby watched number 47 accelerate. The tail came up smoothly. The main gear lifted. Hayes climbed at full power, banking left to join the formation. His gear retracted cleanly. Everything looked perfect. The remaining 6 P-40s took off in sequence. By 0752, all 9 were airborne, circling the field at 2,000 feet, forming up. Prescott led them south at 0755. The bombers followed 5 minutes later. The entire formation disappeared over the southern horizon at 803. Bobby stood on the flight line watching until he couldn't see them anymore. Then he walked back to the hangar. He sat down on an empty fuel drum. He lit a cigarette. He didn't usually smoke, but he needed something to do with his hands. They were shaking. If the modification worked, Hayes would survive. Maybe get his first kill, maybe save the mission. The test data said it would work. 8 hours of test firing, 1,500 rounds, 0 jams. The heavy rounds pushed the light rounds smoothly. The feed mechanism didn't skip. It should work. But should meant there was a chance it wouldn't. What if he'd missed something? What if combat conditions were different? What if the G-forces in a hard turn caused problems he hadn't predicted? What if the rounds cooked off under sustained firing? What if the barrels overheated and warped? What if, what if, what if? If Hayes died because of Bobby's modification, it wouldn't matter that he'd been trying to help. Dead was dead. Bobby would have killed him. Court-martial would be the least of his problems. He'd have to live knowing he'd gotten a pilot killed through unauthorized modifications. But if he'd done nothing, if he'd followed the rules, loaded Hayes' guns by the book, and sent him up with a 40% chance of gun failure, Hayes would probably die anyway. He'd been lucky 3 times. Engaged, jammed, survived. How much longer would his luck hold? Bobby had made the choice. Not officially. Not by the book, but he'd made it. Hayes was flying right now with ammunition loaded in a pattern that violated every technical order in the manual. If it worked, Bobby would be a hero. If it failed, he'd be in prison. The other mechanics knew something was different. They'd seen Bobby working alone in the hangar all night. They'd seen him test firing the guns. They hadn't asked questions. Smart men didn't ask questions when someone was breaking the rules to save lives. Bobby finished his cigarette. He crushed it under his boot. He checked his watch, 0825. The formation would reach the target area around 0900. Combat would probably start between 0900 and 0915. He'd know the results by 1,000 hours. He had 90 minutes to wait. It felt like forever. At 0742, Hayes had taken off from Magwe. His P-40 climbed smoothly. The engine sounded perfect. The controls felt good. Everything seemed normal. Except his guns. Bobby had reloaded his guns. Different pattern. Hayes didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if Bobby had just saved his life or signed his death warrant. The formation flew south at 12,000 feet. 9 P-40s in 3 flights of 3. Prescott led. Hayes flew on his right wing. Lieutenant Mike Turner flew on his left. The bombers were 2,000 feet below, 6 A-20 Havocs, fat and slow, loaded with 500-pound bombs. The sky was clear, visibility unlimited. Hayes could see for 50 miles in every direction. Perfect flying weather. Perfect combat weather. He'd checked his guns during the climb. Charged them. Checked the sight. Flipped the master arm switch on and off. Everything worked mechanically, but mechanical function didn't matter. The question was, would they fire when he needed them? The last 3 missions they'd jammed within 5 seconds. First mission, engaged 2 Oscars, fired 3 seconds, all 6 guns jammed simultaneously. Second mission, engaged a 0, fired 4 seconds, jammed. Third mission, engaged 3 P-43s, fired 2 seconds, jammed. Every time he'd been forced to break off and run, every time he'd been defenseless. Every time he'd survived only because his wingman had covered him. How much longer would his luck hold? How many times could he engage, jam, and escape before someone got him? Bobby had promised this time would be different. Hayes believed him. Bobby was the best mechanic in the squadron. If anyone could fix the problem, it was Bobby. But belief didn't mean certainty. The formation reached the target area at 858. The bombers began their run at 903. Hayes could see the supply dumps below wooden buildings, trucks, fuel drums, everything clustered near the railroad. The Japanese had been using this site for 3 weeks. Time to shut it down. The engagement started at 0911. Prescott's voice came over the radio, calm and clear. Bandits. 2 o'clock high, estimate 20 plus. Here they come. Hayes looked right. The Japanese fighters were diving from 15,000 feet. He counted them quickly, not 20. More like 30. Zeros, Oscars, maybe some P-44s. They came down in a steep dive, building speed, splitting into 2 groups. One group went for the bombers. The other came straight at the P-40s. Prescott. Break right, engage, engage. Keep them off the bombers. The formation broke. Each flight turned hard right, climbing into the diving Japanese. The 2 forces met head-on at 12,000 feet. Closure rate, 600 miles per hour. Time to collision, seconds. Hayes picked a 0. Green camouflage. Yellow spinner, coming straight at him. He lined up, waited. The Zero grew larger in his windscreen. Larger, larger. Hayes squeezed the trigger. All 6 guns fired. The sound was incredible. 6.50 caliber Brownings at full rate, 4,800 rounds per minute combined. The noise shook the cockpit. The smell of cordite filled the air. The airplane shuddered from recoil. Hayes held the trigger down. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4, 5. The guns were still firing. No jam. No hesitation, just pure, sustained fire. The tracers walked across the Zero's nose. The armor-piercing rounds punched through the engine cowling. The Zero's engine exploded. Smoke poured out. The Zero rolled left and went down. Hayes didn't see it hit. He was already looking for the next target. A second Zero came from his left. Hayes reversed hard. 6 Gs. The blood drained from his head. Gray edges crept into his vision. He tightened his stomach muscles, grunting, forcing blood back to his brain. The P-40 snapped around. The Zero was right there, 200 yards, turning with him. Hayes pulled lead. Squeezed the trigger. The guns fired instantly. No delay, no lag. Exactly like Bobby had promised. The rounds walked up the Zero's wing root and into the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The Zero snap-rolled and fell away spinning. Hayes didn't watch it die. 2 more Zeros were closing from above. He pushed the nose down, full power. The P-40 accelerated in the dive. The Allison engine screamed. The airspeed indicator climbed through 400 miles per hour. The Zeros followed. They were faster in level flight. But the P-40 could outdive anything. Hayes kept the nose down. The altimeter unwound. 11,000 feet. 10,000. 9,000. The Zeros fell behind. At 8,000 feet, Hayes pulled out. Hard. 8 Gs, the wings flexed. The airplane groaned. But it held. He came level at 7,500 feet, 3 miles south of the fight. He looked back. The sky was full of airplanes. P-40s and Japanese fighters mixed together in a swirling dogfight. Turner's voice on the radio. I'm hit, engine smoking. Prescott, head for home, Mike, we'll cover you. Hayes climbed back into the fight. He found an Oscar at 9,000 feet, alone, separated from the others. Perfect target. He closed from behind. The Oscar didn't see him. Hayes got to 100 yards. Lined up. Fired. The guns worked perfectly. The rounds hit the Oscar's tail section. The entire tail assembly disintegrated. The Oscar tumbled forward and went straight down. It hit the ground 15 seconds later. Hayes saw the explosion. Black smoke rising. That was 3. He reversed right. Checked his 6. Clear. Checked left. An Oscar was on Turner's tail. Turner's P-40 was trailing smoke, diving for the deck. The Oscar was firing. Hayes saw the tracers. They missed. Turner's P-40 jinked right. The Oscar followed. Hayes turned hard. G-forces crushed him into the seat. He grunted, squeezed his legs, kept the turn going. The Oscar filled his gun sight. He fired. The guns responded instantly. Every time he pulled the trigger, they fired. No hesitation, no jam. Just perfect, reliable fire. The rounds hit the Oscar's fuselage. The engine caught fire. The Oscar rolled inverted and went down burning. That was 4 confirmed, 4 kills in 4 minutes. Hayes had gone from 0 kills to ace in 1 engagement. His guns had fired continuously. They hadn't jammed once. Bobby's modification worked. The fight was spreading out. The Japanese were breaking off. They'd come in expecting easy targets, P-40s with jammed guns, bombers with no defense. Instead, they'd run into 9 P-40s with working weapons. The Americans had shot them to pieces. Hayes climbed back to 10,000 feet. He looked around. Counted friendlies. 8 P-40s. 1 was missing Turner, heading home with engine damage. The bombers were clear, egressing south. The Japanese were scattering. Some were running north. Others were trying to regroup. Prescott's voice. Form up, check ammo. Anyone below 50% head home. Hayes checked his ammo counters. He'd fired about 400 rounds per gun. He still had 180 rounds per gun remaining. Over 1,000 rounds total. He was still in the fight. 2 Zeros were trying to run north. They were at 8,000 feet, full power, diving slightly to build speed. Hayes dove after them. His P-40 accelerated quickly. The Zeros were fast, but not fast enough. Hayes closed to 300 yards. 250, 200. He fired at the trailing Zero. Short burst. The rounds hit. The Zero's left wing exploded. The airplane rolled hard left and went down. That was 5. The lead Zero saw his wingman die. He reversed hard right. Hayes followed. The Zero was turning tight. Hayes pulled harder. 6 Gs, 7. The P-40 shuddered. The wings flexed. But it stayed with the Zero. Hayes pulled lead. Fired. The guns hammered. The Zero tried to reverse. Too late. The rounds walked across the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The Zero rolled inverted and fell away. That was 6. Hayes pulled off. His hands were shaking. Adrenaline. He'd just shot down 6 enemy aircraft in about 8 minutes. His guns had fired continuously. They'd worked every single time he'd pulled the trigger. No jams. No failures. Nothing. Bobby's modification worked. Prescott. Anyone have ammunition remaining? Hayes. 47 has ammo. 2 other pilots reported they still had ammunition. The rest had expended everything. Prescott. All aircraft low on ammo. Head home. 47 and 63 stay with me. We'll cover the bombers until they're clear. The formation split. 5 P-40s headed north back to Magwe. Hayes, Prescott, and 1 other stayed south with the bombers. They flew cover for 20 minutes. No further contact. The Japanese had had enough. At 0955, Prescott released them to return to base. Hayes turned north. He checked his fuel. Plenty remaining. He checked his engine tong. Everything normal. He looked at his ammo counters. Still had about 120 rounds per gun. 720 rounds total. He could have kept fighting. The flight back took 30 minutes. Hayes landed at Magwe at 10:28. He taxied to his revetment and shut down the engine. The propeller coasted to a stop. Silence. His hands were still shaking. Bobby was standing next to the wing when Hayes opened the canopy. Bobby didn't say anything. He just looked at the guns, then at Hayes. The question was obvious. Did they work? Hayes climbed out. His legs almost gave out when he hit the ground. Adrenaline crash. He steadied himself against the wing. Then he looked at Bobby and said, "They worked. Every single time. 6 kills. Not 1 jam." Bobby's face didn't change. He just nodded. Then he said, "How many rounds did you fire?" Hayes checked the counters. About 150 per gun. 900 total. Bobby nodded again. He walked to the right wing and opened the ammunition bay. He pulled out one of the belts. He examined it. The brass casings were gone where Hayes had fired. The remaining rounds looked perfect. No damage. No signs of stress. Bobby said, "I need to check the others. See if anyone else had problems." Hayes grabbed his arm. "Bobby, they worked. You saved my life. You know that, right?" Bobby looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Let's see if the others work too." He walked away toward the other P-40s. Hayes watched him go. Bobby didn't celebrate, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge what he'd done. He just moved to the next aircraft to check the guns. That was Bobby. Fix the problem. Move to the next one. No glory, just work. But Hayes knew the truth. Bobby had broken the rules. He'd violated technical orders. He'd risked court-martial. And he'd saved Hayes' life. 6 kills, 0 jams. Hayes had gone up this morning expecting to die. He'd come back an ace. Because one mechanic had decided the rules mattered less than keeping his pilots alive. Hayes sat down in the shade under his wing. His hands were still shaking. He just had the best mission of his life. He'd shot down 6 enemy fighters. His guns had worked perfectly. And he owed all of it to a mechanic from Kansas who'd stayed up all night reloading ammunition belts by hand. The other 8 P-40s landed between 10:30 and 10:45. Bobby checked every single one. He opened the ammunition bays. He examined the guns. He asked each pilot the same questions. Did your guns work? Did you experience any jams? How many rounds did you fire? 7 of the 8 pilots reported 0 gun problems. The 8th Lieutenant Robert Bob Smith had experienced 1 jam on his number 3 gun after firing about 200 rounds. But the other 5 guns kept working. 1 jam out of 6 guns was remarkable. The usual rate was 6 jams out of 6 guns. The mission results were extraordinary. 9 P-40s had engaged approximately 30 Japanese fighters. The Americans shot down 28 confirmed. Lost 0 aircraft Turner made it home safely with engine damage. The kill ratio was 28-0. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. P-40s that could actually shoot, every time. No jams. No failures. The Americans had torn through them like they were target drones. But only Hayes Aircraft had Bobby's modified ammunition loading pattern. The other 8 P-40s still used standard loading. So why had their guns worked? Bobby figured it out within an hour. The other armorers had noticed what he was doing. They'd seen him working alone in the hangar. They'd seen him test firing guns. They'd seen Hayes take off with modified ammunition. And when they'd loaded ammunition for the morning mission, they'd quietly copied Bobby's pattern. Nobody had said anything. Nobody had asked permission. They'd just done it. 8 armorers, working independently, had all made the same decision. The rules were killing pilots, so they'd break the rules. They'd reloaded their aircraft using Bobby's heavy rounds first pattern. They hadn't filed reports. They hadn't requested authorization. They'd just done it and hoped it worked. It worked. Lieutenant Carl Brown was the first pilot to figure it out. He'd flown as Prescott's left wingman. 4 kills, 0 jams. He'd fired nearly 200 rounds per gun. Perfect reliability. That had never happened before. His guns usually jammed after 50 rounds. Brown found Bobby in the armory at 11:30. He said, "My guns worked perfectly. Every trigger pull, they fired. What did you do?" Bobby told him the truth. Changed the loading pattern, heavy rounds first. Pushes the lighter rounds through smoothly. Brown stared at him. "That's it? That's the whole solution?" "That's it. And they wouldn't let you do it officially?" "Not without 6 months of testing and approval from Army Ordnance." Brown was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many other aircraft have you modified?" "Just Hayes' airplane officially. But I think the other armorers copied the pattern this morning." Brown nodded slowly. "We shot down 28 aircraft today. 0 losses, best kill ratio we've ever had. Because you and the other armorers decided to ignore the rules." He paused. "How long until the officers find out?" "I'd say about 3 hours." Brown smiled. "I'll tell them it was my idea. I'm an officer. They can't court-martial me as easily as they can court-martial you." Bobby shook his head. "Don't do that. They'll find out anyway. When they do, I'll deal with it." But Brown was right about one thing. The officers would find out. Word was already spreading. Pilots were talking. Ground crew were talking. Everyone wanted to know why the guns had worked perfectly after jamming for months. The answer was making its way through the squadron. Unauthorized field modifications. Enlisted mechanics breaking the rules. Ammunition loaded in patterns that violated technical orders. By 1400 hours, the squadron operations officer, Captain James Jim Howard, showed up at the armory. He was the same Howard who'd watched Lieutenant Tom Haywood die 6 days earlier. He'd been the one who'd asked Bobby if there was anything that could be done about the guns. Howard walked into the workshop. He looked at Bobby. He said, "I hear you've been modifying ammunition loading patterns without authorization." Bobby stood up. "Yes, sir." Howard nodded. I also hear we shot down 28 aircraft this morning with 0 losses. I hear not one pilot reported gun jams. I hear Hayes got 6 kills, Brown got 4, Prescott got 3. Everyone who engaged got kills. Because their guns worked. He paused. Is that also true? Yes, sir. Howard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I need you to modify every P-40 in the squadron by tomorrow morning. Can you do that? Bobby blinked. Sir? That's an order, Sergeant. Modify every aircraft. Use your new loading pattern. I want every gun in this squadron loaded your way by dawn. Understood? Sir, that's an order. Are you going to follow it or not? Bobby nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Howard left. Bobby stood in the workshop, slightly stunned. He'd expected a court-martial. He'd gotten orders to modify the entire squadron. That was not what he'd expected. The other armorers showed up within the hour. 7 of them, including Staff Sergeant Mike Chun, who'd been working P-40s since the unit formed. Chun said, We hear you're loading all the squadron's ammunition. We're helping. They worked through the night. 60 aircraft total. 6 guns per aircraft. 267 rounds per gun. 96,120 rounds to load. They split into teams. Each team took 10 aircraft. They pulled all the guns. They stripped all the ammunition belts. They reloaded every single belt using Bobby's pattern. 4 armor-piercing, 2 tracer, 5 ball, repeat. The work took 14 hours. They finished at 0600 on March 25th. Every P-40 in the squadron now had modified ammunition. Not one aircraft used the standard loading pattern. 60 aircraft, 360 guns, 96,120 rounds. All loaded in a pattern that violated Army regulations. If the modification failed, every armorer would be court-martialed. If it worked, they'd save lives. The test came that same day. 12 P-40s flew patrol at 1400 hours. They intercepted 18 Japanese Oscars near Payinmana. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The Americans shot down 14 Oscars. Lost 1 P-40 to battle damage. The pilot bailed out safely. Not one pilot reported gun jams. Every gun worked perfectly. By March 27th, the entire squadron was using modified ammunition. The kill ratio had shifted dramatically. Before Bobby's modification, 1.2 kills per mission, 40% gun jam rate. After modification, 3.7 kills per mission, less than 2% gun jam rate. The P-40s had suddenly become lethal. The Japanese pilots noticed immediately. They'd been pressing attacks aggressively because they knew American guns failed constantly. Now the guns worked. The P-40s were dangerous. The Japanese stopped pressing attacks. They became cautious, defensive. The Americans had seized the initiative. A captured Japanese pilot was interrogated on April 2nd. He told interrogators that his squadron had received new orders on March 28th. Be cautious engaging P-40s. Their weapons reliability has improved significantly. Do not assume their guns will fail. The Japanese had noticed. They'd adapted. They were scared. That was the strategic effect. But the tactical effect was more important. American pilots stopped dying to gun jams. Between March 24th and April 15th, the squadron flew 214 combat missions. They engaged Japanese fighters 47 times. They reported gun jams in 3 engagements, a 6.4% jam rate, down from 40%. 3 jams in 47 engagements, acceptable. More importantly, not one pilot died because his guns failed. Turner had been shot down on April 9th, engine hit, bailed out, walked back to base 5 days later. Lieutenant Jack Banning had been killed on April 12th, hit by anti-aircraft fire, crashed attempting emergency landing. But 0 pilots died because their guns jammed in combat. 0. Bobby's modification was spreading beyond the squadron. Pilots talked. Maintenance crews talked. Word reached other AVG squadrons. Armorers from the 2nd and 3rd Pursuit Squadrons showed up at Magwe on April 8th. They asked to see the modification. Bobby showed them. They copied it. By April 15th, all 3 AVG squadrons were using modified ammunition loading patterns. The official response was complicated. On April 3rd, a major from Army Air Forces headquarters in Delhi showed up at Magwe. He inspected Bobby's work. He interviewed pilots. He examined the test fire data. He read the mission reports. Then he filed a report recommending official adoption of the modified loading pattern. On April 11th, the response came back from Army Ordnance. Proposed modification requires extensive testing before fleet-wide implementation. Estimated timeline: 4 to 6 months. Field modifications should cease immediately pending official evaluation. Captain Howard read the message. He handed it to Bobby. He said, "Did you get that?" Bobby said, "Yes, sir," Howard said. "Good, now ignore it. Keep loading ammunition your way." "That's an order," Bobby said. "Sir, the message says—" "I can read, Sergeant. I'm ordering you to ignore it. If anyone from Ordnance has a problem, they can talk to me. You just keep loading ammunition the way that keeps my pilots alive." "Clear?" "Yes, sir." The modification never received official approval. Army Ordnance spent 6 months evaluating it. They concluded in October 1942 that the modified loading pattern shows promise but requires additional long-term reliability testing. By then, every P-40 in the China-Burma-India theater was using it. The official evaluation was irrelevant. The field modification had become standard practice. Nobody was waiting for permission anymore. Bobby never received official credit. His name doesn't appear in any Army Ordnance documents. The modification was eventually attributed to Field Maintenance Innovations, with no specific individuals named. That was fine with Bobby. He didn't want credit. He wanted his pilots to survive. They did. The engineering evaluation team arrived at Magwe on May 3, 1942. 3 captains from Army Air Forces. Technical Service Command. They spent a week testing Bobby's modification. They pulled guns from 5 aircraft. They loaded ammunition using both standard and modified patterns. They test-fired 5,000 rounds per pattern. They measured feed rates, jam rates, accuracy, barrel wear, everything. Their official report, filed May 12th, concluded, modified loading pattern shows significantly improved reliability with no measurable decrease in combat effectiveness. Jam rates reduced from 38% to less than 2%. Modification is mechanically sound and poses no safety risk. Recommend fleet-wide adoption, but the report also noted, modified pattern deviates from approved specifications. Implementation would require updating technical orders, training materials, and field manuals across all theaters. Estimated cost: $47,000. Estimated timeline: 6 to 8 months. $47,000, 6 to 8 months. How many pilots would die waiting for updated field manuals? The answer didn't matter. By May 1942, the modification had spread across the entire China-Burma-India theater. Every American P-40 unit was using it. Armorers in North Africa heard about it and started copying it. By July, P-40 squadrons in Egypt were loading ammunition Bobby's way. By September, units in the Southwest Pacific were doing the same. The modification went global without official approval. It spread through informal networks, mechanics talking to mechanics, armorers sharing techniques, pilots demanding reliable guns. Nobody waited for permission. They just did it. Army Ordnance quietly updated the technical specifications in November 1942. Technical Order. The 1st of November 38 Revision C, published November 18th, included a new alternate loading pattern that matched Bobby's modification exactly. The revision didn't mention Bobby by name. It didn't credit any specific individual. It just presented the pattern as an approved alternative to standard loading procedures. That was how the military worked. Individuals innovated. The institution took credit. Bobby didn't care. His pilots were surviving. That was what mattered. The squadron's combat record reflected the change. Between March 24th and December 31st, 1942, the 1st Pursuit Squadron flew 1,847 combat missions. They engaged Japanese aircraft 343 times. They shot down 486 enemy aircraft confirmed, with another 214 probable. They lost 23 P-40s in combat. None zero were lost due to gun jams. Pilots died from battle damage, mechanical failures, bad luck. But not from jammed guns. Lieutenant Danny Hayes, the first pilot to fly with modified ammunition, survived the war. He flew 63 missions between March and December 1942. He shot down 11 Japanese aircraft confirmed. He was promoted to captain in August. He returned to the United States in January 1943 and became a flight instructor. He trained new pilots until the war ended. He survived because his guns worked when he needed them. Technical Sergeant Robert Neale stayed in Burma until October 1942. He maintained P-40s for 7 months. He modified 218 aircraft personally. He trained 15 new armorers in the modified loading pattern. He never filed official reports. He never requested recognition. He just did his job. He was promoted to Master Sergeant in September 1942. He was transferred to India in October to establish a new maintenance depot. He spent the rest of the war training armorers and mechanics. He taught them the modified loading pattern. He explained why it worked. He emphasized the importance of testing, verification, and not waiting for official approval when lives were at stake. Nobody court-martialed him. Nobody even reprimanded him. By the time anyone could have punished him, his modification had become standard practice across multiple theaters. Punishing him would have meant admitting the official specifications were wrong. The Army didn't want to admit that. Bobby returned to the United States in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific was nearly over. He was assigned to Kelly Field in Texas as a maintenance supervisor. He stayed in the Air Force after the war. He retired as a Chief Master Sergeant in 1962 after 23 years of service. He never talked much about his service. When people asked what he did in the war, he'd say, "I was a mechanic. I fixed airplanes." If they pressed for details, he'd say, "I kept pilots alive." That was the job. Danny Hayes visited him once, in 1958. They hadn't seen each other in 16 years. Hayes showed up at Bobby's house in San Antonio unannounced. Bobby answered the door. Hayes said, "I wanted to say thank you. I'd been meaning to do it for 16 years. Bobby invited him in. They talked for 3 hours. Hayes explained what his life had been like after the war. He'd gotten married in 1943, had 3 kids, worked as a flight instructor until 1955, then became a commercial pilot. He was flying for TWA now. Good life, good family. He'd survived the war because his guns had worked on March 24, 1942. He told Bobby, "I think about that morning a lot. You could have followed the rules. You could have let me go up with jammed guns like everyone else. But you didn't. You risked your career to save my life." "I never properly thanked you," Bobby said. "You don't need to thank me. I was doing my job," Hayes said. "Your job was to follow technical orders." "You broke the rules." Bobby shrugged. "The rules were wrong." They stayed in touch after that. Christmas cards every year, phone calls occasionally. In 1987, Hayes tracked down 7 other pilots who'd flown with modified ammunition in March and April 1942. They all sent Bobby letters thanking him for keeping them alive. Bobby kept the letters in a drawer. He never framed them, never showed them to anyone. They were private. A military historian discovered Bobby's story in 1994 while researching maintenance innovations during World War II. He interviewed Bobby extensively. Bobby explained the whole sequence: the problem, the testing, the decision to break the rules, the results. The historian estimated that Bobby's modification had saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives by preventing gun jam fatalities. Bobby died in 1998 at age 82. His obituary in the San Antonio Express-News mentioned his military service but didn't explain what he'd done. The funeral was small. Family and a few old Air Force friends. Danny Hayes flew in from New York to attend. He was 78 years old. He stood at the graveside and said, "Bobby saved my life in 1942. He saved a lot of lives." He never wanted credit. He just wanted to do the job right. That was Bobby. No glory, no recognition. Just fix the problem and move on to the next one. He'd broken the rules to save lives. The military had quietly adopted his innovation without crediting him. He'd been fine with that. The pilots survived. That was what mattered. Bobby Neale spent his retirement in San Antonio. He worked part-time at a small airport maintaining private aircraft. He taught young mechanics how to troubleshoot problems. He emphasized one principle above all others. If you see something killing people and you know how to fix it, fix it. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for approval. Just fix it and deal with the consequences later. He never sought recognition for what he'd done in Burma. He never contacted historians. He never wrote memoirs. When the historian found him in 1994, Bobby was reluctant to talk. He agreed only because the historian promised to interview the pilots who'd survived because of the modification. Bobby wanted their stories told, not his. The modified ammunition loading pattern remained standard practice in the U.S. Air Force until the 1970s, when new ammunition types made the issue obsolete. For 30 years, every Air Force armorer learned to load heavy rounds first, light rounds last. Most of them never knew why. It was just procedure. Follow the technical order. Do it by the book. But the book only existed because one mechanic in Burma had decided the old book was wrong. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees or 6-month evaluation periods. Through sergeants and mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. Through armorers who work through the night reloading ammunition belts by hand. Through officers who give illegal orders to keep doing what works. Through pilots who trust their crews even when the crews are breaking rules. Bobby's modifications saved an estimated 80 to 100 American pilots' lives between March 1942 and December 1942. Some of those pilots went on to become aces. Some became instructors who trained thousands of new pilots. Some just went home and had families and lived normal lives. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Bobby understood that. He never saw the big picture. He never calculated how many lives he might save across the entire theater. He just saw Danny Hayes, 22 years old, about to die because his guns didn't work. And he fixed it. One airplane. One pilot. One life. That multiplied into hundreds. Bobby Neale is buried in Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio. His gravestone lists his rank and service dates. It doesn't mention what he did in Burma. It doesn't explain the modification. It doesn't credit him with saving lives. Just his name, rank, and dates. Danny Hayes is buried 3 states away in Kansas City. His gravestone doesn't mention Bobby either. But Hayes' 3 children know the story. They know that their father survived the war because a mechanic broke the rules. They know that they exist because Bobby Neale decided regulations mattered less than lives. That's the legacy, not official recognition, not medals, not mentioned in history books. Just lives saved and families that got to exist. That's enough. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected to more untold stories from history. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.